Hello again, friends. Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about the supplies you need if you decide you want to start as a stained glass artist. If you're new here, I'm Jen, single mom, artist, and entrepreneur, and this channel is all about building a life that you love. So if you've been around for a little while at all, then you know that I am a stained glass artist, and I get asked all the time about learning to do stained glass. People are really interested in it, and I love that because it is kind of a dying art. And I love seeing people want to breathe new life into old techniques and learn old techniques that are maybe kind of falling out of fashion. So that's really exciting to me. But the supply list for starting as a stained glass artist is kind of lengthy. So I definitely feel like it's something you should go in with your eyes open. So today I want to walk you through all of the tools that I use on a daily basis so that you can get a really good idea of what it takes in order to do this as a hobby and get started with it. So without further ado, let's take a little studio tour. So the first tools you're going to need are a glass cutter. Now these are two different kinds of glass cutters. This one is a pencil styled glass cutter, so you hold it like it's a pencil. This one is a pistol grip styled glass cutter. This one is more ergonomic, so it's easier on your hands. So your glass cutter doesn't actually cut the glass, it just scores it. It's not sharp, you can't cut yourself on that. That's kind of just a detail that might be good to know. You're gonna need some sort of breaking apparatus. These are called running pliers. So these are used, oh, let me not use that. I'm saving that piece. I'm gonna cut stars out of that yellow. So when you score your glass with your glass cutter, your running pliers push down. They're slightly curved, so they push down on the glass on either side and make the glass just break evenly. This has a glass breaker on the back of it, so after you score your glass, you can use it to tap your glass, and eventually it will run the score line all the way through and break. Or one last option are these breaking pliers, which you use by lining up with your score, and you just pull. So you're going to need cutters and breaking tools. Obviously you need glass. An optional tool is this light table and waffle grid that I'm using here. The waffle grid is nice because it catches all these teeny pieces of glass that break and crumble when you're cutting glass, and so it's easier to keep your workspace clean and clean up. The light box is nice, but not a requirement. But what I like about the light box is when I'm using a pattern, this is my pattern for my succulents, I can lay my glass on my pattern on the light box, and I can see my pattern underneath to draw my pattern in. So the light box is nice, but it's not a requirement. I do highly recommend gloves. These are nitrile gloves. Fabric on one side and they're rubber on this other side. So the rubber keeps the glass shards out of your hands. I only wear them about half of the time, and every time I don't, I regret it. The next tool you're going to need is a grinder. Now what this does is, this is kind of like an emery board but for glass, and it grinds the sharp edges off of your glass so that you won't get cut on them, and so that they don't cut your copper foil when you are foiling your glass. Now, you're most likely going to want to wear those nitrile gloves with these. You're also going to want and need a pair of safety goggles or glasses, because as it grinds the glass, a lot of times it will fly up at your face. The last thing you want is glass in your eye. Been there, done that. It's not fun. Okay, moving right along. You're going to need either copper foil, that's what this is. I use that for the Tiffany method. This is the method I use the most. It's like a copper tape that you wrap around your glass. If you're using the copper foil method, you're going to need a fid, which really anything can be a fit, a pencil, a stick, the side of your fingernail, whatever you want. It's just a plastic tool that helps you to burnish the copper foil to your glass, which means to make sure that it's sticking really, really good, okay? If you're not using the Tiffany method and you're going to use traditional stained glass method, then you're going to need lead. This is 1/4 inch lead. It looks like an H. It's got a groove on either side. And the way that this works is that the glass actually fits inside the channel. The lead wraps around the glass and the glass fits inside the channel. Can you see that? So the lead wraps around the glass and the glass fits inside the channel. And then you solder the ends of the channels. So that is traditional stained glass, is with lead. Or the Tiffany style method, which is how Tiffany lamps are made, are done with copper foil. Copper foil is the most versatile in my opinion. It's really good for smaller sun catchers. Lead is really, really soft and it bends and loosens over time. So you may notice the next time you go into a church that has big, beautiful stained glass windows, if those windows are old, if you look at those windows, as you look up the window, there's going to be steel bars across them, which are reinforcement that has been added after the fact to keep the glass in one place, because as the lead stretches over time and as it ages, that glass starts to slump. So the steel bars are to hold it back in place, hold it tight, but it will start to slump. So lead is also, in my opinion, a little bit harder to work with, but I've done it, and by all means you should try it. If you're working with copper foil, all you need to cut it is a pair of scissors. You can actually rip it by hand. If you're working with lead, you're going to need lead nippers and a lead knife to be able to cut that lead in between pieces. You're also going to need solder. This is 60-40 solder. With the Tiffany method, you're going to solder all parts of that copper foil. With traditional leaded stained glass, you're only going to solder the joints where the lead meets together in your project. So you're going to solder, say this is wrapped around a piece of glass. Look, I could just do it. So if this is where my two pieces meet, so I'm going to solder this joint here. I'm not going to solder all of this because this has already got lead. Now, how do you turn this rod of solder into the solder around your project? That is with a soldering iron. Now, soldering irons for stained glass are not the same soldering irons that people use for electrical solder work. That solder has a much lower melt point than solder for stained glass. So you want to get a stained glass specific soldering iron. You're going to want some sort of stand to keep it in. You're going to want some sort of heat resistant sponge or other cleaning method to clean your iron while you're using it. You can see the tip of mine right now is like totally filthy. Look how filthy that is, because I didn't clean it when I was done using it last. And so you're going to get this, you keep a wet sponge so that you can be wiping your iron off on it as you're working. This particular soldering iron has what we call a rheostat with it, which lets me control the temperature. So the iron plugs into this. This is the temperature control, and then this plugs into the wall. Not all soldering irons are like that. Some have built-in rheostats. Some, the temperature is controlled by the kind of tip that you buy. It totally depends on the kind of soldering iron that you purchase. You are going to need, let me get this out of the way, a brush, and you are going to need flux. Now, you're going to need flux. This is a gel flux. It's my preference. I put a little in this little cup, and then I scoop it out onto my brush when I need it for soldering. Flux is what makes your solder actually flow on your project. So whether you're using the Tiffany method or leaded glass, you're always going to need flux. So you're going to need the actual flux itself, some sort of brush to apply it with. It's usually a container to put your flux into. I highly, highly recommend heat resistant gloves. These are, I bought them at the Dollar Tree. They're, again, those neoprene rubber gloves, but they do help insulate your hands from a little bit of heat. If you're working on a really small project, like if this was the piece of glass I'm working on and I'm soldering this part of it, the whole glass gets hot. So if I have a pair of gloves on for the hand that's holding it, it's gonna be a godsend. It's really gonna help protect your hands when you're working. So now the gloves, they don't have to be expensive. Like I said, these came from the Dollar Tree, but highly recommend. You're gonna need a surface to solder on. This is just a piece of pressed MDF board from the hardware store. I have also used old ceiling tiles to work on. I kind of like those for small projects because if I want, once I put my pieces together, if I want to hold them in place, these are not even the same kind of glass, I can use push pins on those ceiling tiles. Whereas those don't work in this board so well. This board is better for using actual glass nails to hold your piece in pieces in place. But you're not going to want to solder directly on a tabletop. You're going to ruin it. You want to use something to solder on that isn't going to ruin, because you're going to get, this is flux that's all over this board. It's full of imperfections. There's solder dug down into pieces of it. And this board's new. I just started using this board about 2 weeks ago. So, you know, occasionally I toss out a board and get a new one because they do get kind of trashed as time goes on. You're going to need something to clean your flux off of your finished projects with. Now they make a legit flux cleaner, but I actually just use, generally speaking, rubbing alcohol because it breaks down the flux, it gets the flux off. You can wash them in the sink, but I don't like to do that because I feel like that extra water, even though I am confident in my soldering and in my in how well I burnished my copper foil, I don't want to give any additional opportunities for moisture to get underneath that foil, because that is not good for your project. So I just avoid water altogether. I use rubbing alcohol because that works the best for me. So I put it in a spray bottle, I spray it on my project, and then I clean it off with a towel. And I can clean it 2 or 3 times if I feel like it needs it. The last thing that you're gonna need is a container of carnauba wax. Once your solder, even on a finished project, sits around for a long, long time, it is subject to corrosion because it has a high lead content and lead corrodes. So carnauba wax, believe it or not, is what I use to polish my pieces. It's not about polishing the glass itself, it's about polishing the solder itself because it helps put a coating on the lead and it helps protect the lead from corrosion. You can also clean your old stained glass using carnauba wax. Put it on, let it, sit for just a few minutes, and then buff it off, just like you do a car. So there you go. That's all your basic tools that you're going to need to be a stained glass artist. I know that list was pretty long. It's a lot of things. It is a lot. It's a lot. And then you still have the investment in the glass itself, and the glass is not inexpensive. Certain colors are far more expensive than others. Reds and pinks are the most expensive colors. Purples are next. And obviously, if you're going to want to make a nice array of projects, you're going to need a lot of different colors and a lot of different, and I like having lots of different textures and things like that to choose from as well. So the glass part, that's the real expensive part. It is, I'm not going to lie to you. Soldering irons, a good soldering iron is going to run you probably around $100 for a really nice one. If you're serious, don't go cheap on your soldering iron. Buy a nice one. You're gonna thank me later. I have personally burned out multiple cheap soldering irons, and yeah, I don't recommend. I do not recommend. Obviously, there are some things you can get away without having, like the light box that I use. That's not a necessity, but man, is it nice. You could get away without a grinder, probably. I didn't have a grinder when I first started. I made my first 3 or 4 projects without a grinder. A grinder runs around $100, maybe sometimes up to $2, depending on the brand that you purchase. I did my first 2 or 3 projects without a grinder, but I'm telling you, they would have been really nice. They would have been a lot nicer projects had I had a grinder. Not only does it smooth those edges off so that your copper foil lays nice and without tearing, but it also helps you grind off. You can grind off any little weird bumps and stuff that keep your glass from fitting together perfectly. So the grinder it's something you could get by without while you learn the rest of the techniques and really decide if this is for you. But ultimately, it's definitely something that you're going to want. I will say, the one thing about learning without having a grinder initially is that it forces you to get really, really good at cutting, because I know a lot of people that rely way too heavily on their grinder. They get their cuts like sort of close, and then they just grind and grind and grind and grind to get things the way they really want it. And I mean, you can do that, but you're going to go through a whole lot of grinder wheels, and it's going to take a lot more time. And it'd just be better to like be really good at cutting. Grinders run anywhere from $100 to $300 depending on the brand. That grinder that I showed you was a cheapie. I only paid $100 for it, and it does just fine. I've had it about 5 years now. I'm sure eventually, I'm positive I'll burn the motor out on it before too terribly long. And it is what it is. It was only a $100 investment. I'll just buy a new one, and I'll buy a nicer one. But I was just getting started, and as a means to an end, I don't think that, I think you can get by with a less expensive grinder, absolutely. It does one thing, which is spin the grinder wheel. That's it. That's all it does. Your actual glass cutters and your running pliers and things like that, all of that is fairly inexpensive, probably under $20. You can get really expensive glass cutters. I think that brass glass, the pencil styled glass cutter that I showed you, that brass one, I think it was $30. The pistol grip probably runs around $30. You can buy the cheap ones that they sell at the hardware store for $10, and you know what? They work. I can use a cheapie, no problem. It's a scoring tool. It's just that the nicer ones are easier on your hands if you're going to be doing a lot of cutting. I will warn you, stained glass work takes up a lot of space. As you noticed, I have a cutting station, a grinding station, and this is my soldering station here at my desk. This is where I'm sitting. So it does take up a lot of space. I could theoretically cut and solder in the same spot. I could cut here. I just choose not to, because cutting makes a lot of little tiny glass shards, and I like to keep those contained to one area so that I really only have to sweep up that area every time I'm done cutting. And to be honest, it doesn't even always happen every time. Yeah, people don't come. Yeah, I tell people, don't come in my office barefoot. You will regret that, I promise. But it keeps the glass shards fairly contained within a 2 by 2 foot area, which for me is important because I just like that. I hope that you found this really helpful. There are obviously other tools that I have that aren't necessary. Like, I have various kinds of wire cutters and pliers, and I use these for all kinds of different things. Sometimes I use them to cut solder. Sometimes I'm using them to, ouch, I just pinched myself, to hold hangers while I'm soldering them in place. You can get by without that stuff. And honestly, if you have a basic toolkit, you probably have all that kind of thing kind of laying around anyway. As with anything, you're always going to find tools that you end up needing or that you feel like would make the job simpler. But many of them are not like an absolute necessity. So yeah, hope you found that helpful. And if you decide you're going to get started in stained glass, let me know in the comments. I want to hear about it. I want to know how your experience is and what you love about it. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you soon.